The spring of 1931 came late to western Montana. Snow still clung to the upper ridges in March, pale and stubborn, the way old grief clings to a person long after the world has moved on. A young engineer from the University of Montana made the climb on a Tuesday morning, his leather satchel over one shoulder, a measuring instrument tucked under his arm. The Historical Society had sent him. They wanted documentation, numbers, facts. What he found was something he hadn't expected. The cabin sat halfway up the ridge, half hidden against the slope as though the mountain itself had grown around it. Frost still traced the edges of the front windows. The chimney stood straight and solid, and when he pushed open the door and stepped inside, he stopped. He checked his thermometer twice. 54 degrees. Inside. In March. With no fire burning. Outside, the temperature was 14 below zero. He stood very still for a long moment, listening to nothing but the wind moving across the ridge above him. Then he began to walk the walls slowly, running his hand along the stone. Thick, dense, set deep into the hillside behind the cabin so that the mountain itself became the fourth wall. He had studied engineering for 6 years. He had never seen anything built quite like this. It was near the back wall, behind the old iron stove, that he found it. A tin box, small, rusted at the edges, nailed directly into the stone. He worked it free carefully, the old nails giving way with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, folded twice, were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a single sheet of legal stationery, an official document signed and stamped. The second was older, much older. The paper had gone the color of weak tea, and the handwriting was a woman's, careful and deliberate. Each letter pressed firmly into the page as though she had needed the words to last. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he sat down on the stone floor of that cold cabin and did not move for a long time. The note in that box was not written by Maren Whitfield. It was written by the person who had tried hardest to take everything from her. And when the people of Alder Creek finally read it, not one of them could speak. But that is the end of the story. And every story worth telling has to begin at the beginning. The beginning was an autumn morning in 1912. October. The kind of cold that arrives before you're ready for it. Sharp and sudden. The kind that reminds you the world does not particularly care about your plans. Maren Whitfield was 42 years old. She was not a fragile woman. She had spent 20 years keeping a household, raising a daughter, managing accounts, repairing furniture, and quietly learning everything her husband couldn't be bothered to fix himself. She had strong hands and a steady gaze and a mind that moved like water, finding the low places, filling them, moving on. But on that October morning, her hands were shaking. She stood on the front step of the house she had lived in for 11 years and held a letter from a law office in Billings. Harlan Whitfield, her father-in-law, a man she had spoken to perhaps 40 times in her life, had filed a legal claim against the estate of his son. Her husband, Thomas, had died the previous winter. A logging accident, a sled on a frozen river. It had taken him in under a minute, the men said. He hadn't suffered. Maren had. Quietly, the way women were expected to. And now this. The lawyer's letter was 3 pages long. Maren had read it 4 times that morning. The language was careful and professional, but the meaning was not complicated. Everything belonged to the Whitfield family line. The house, the land, the savings Thomas had left. All of it was to be returned to Harlan Whitfield's estate, as Thomas had died without a formal will. There was one line near the bottom of the final page that Marin read and reread until the words seemed to stop making sense. Mrs. Whitfield was never a legal heir to Whitfield property. She was, in the estimation of the estate, a temporary domestic arrangement entered into by the deceased. She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, went inside, and began to pack. She didn't cry. Not then. There would be time for that later, alone, when Della was asleep and couldn't hear it. Della was 8 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth. And she stood in the doorway of the bedroom watching Marin fill the trunk with careful, methodical movements. The good wool blankets first, then the cooking tools, then the small leather book of her father's geological notes that Marin had kept on the nightstand since the day Thomas died. "Where are we going?" Della asked. "West," Marin said. "A little further west." They arrived in Alder Creek on a Thursday afternoon with $31, a single trunk, and a shepherd dog Della had not yet acquired, but would, within the week, refuse to leave behind. The town was small. 28 buildings clustered along a creek in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges. A general store, a blacksmith forge, a church with a bell that rang on Sundays and during emergencies, in that order of frequency. Marin asked at the general store about land. The man behind the counter, heavy-set with a flour-dusted apron, looked at her the way men in small towns look at women who arrive alone, which is to say, with a calculation happening behind the eyes that has nothing to do with hospitality. "Got one plot available," he said. "Up on the East Ridge. Steep ground. Nobody's wanted it." "How much?" $4. She bought it that afternoon. The following morning, she and Della climbed the ridge trail for the first time. The plot was narrow and steep, facing west, with a clear view down into the valley. Marin stood on the slope and looked at the ground beneath her feet, the way it angled, the way the rock pushed through the earth in long, flat shelves, the way the hillside curved just slightly inward here, like a palm half closed. She knelt and pressed her hand flat against the earth. Her father had been a professor of geology at a small college in Ohio. He had taken Marin into the field every summer from the time she was 6 years old, teaching her to read stone the way other fathers taught their daughters to read books. She could identify rock strata by color and texture. She could tell you which direction water moved through a given hillside. She could look at a slope and tell you, within a reasonable margin, what the ground would do when it was asked to hold weight. She could also tell you, by looking at the snowpack on the ridges above this valley, that the fracture lines forming in the upper cornices were not normal winter settling. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she had $31, a daughter, and a piece of steep ground that no one else wanted. She stood up, brushed the soil from her palm. "Can we really live up here, Mama?" Della asked from behind her. Marin looked out over the valley below, the neat cabins along the creek, the smoke rising from the forge, the church steeple pale against the gray autumn sky, all of it sitting flat on the valley floor, right where the creek curved, right where the water had carved those banks for years, patient and slow and certain. She thought about the lawyer's letter in her coat pocket, about the word temporary, about the fact that Harlan Whitfield had decided, from a great distance and with no apparent effort, that she and her daughter could simply be removed from their lives the way you remove a piece of furniture from a room, efficiently, without sentiment, because the room belonged to someone else. She had spent 11 years making a home. She was not done making homes. She thought of her father's voice, the particular way he said things when he wanted her to remember them. Marin, the earth never lies. You just have to learn its language. She turned to face the hillside, took in the angle of the slope, the depth of the exposed rock, the way the hill curved inward exactly where she would need it to. We can, she said, and we will. Down in the valley, smoke rose from 28 chimneys. No one was watching the ridge. No one was watching the woman who had just decided that the worst piece of land in Alder Creek was exactly what she needed. No one was watching, except the fracture lines in the snow above them, silent and patient, growing longer every day. She started with the foundation. Not the walls, not the roof, not the door frame the way most builders began. The foundation. Because Marin Whitfield had learned from a man who believed that everything standing above the ground was only as good as what you put into it first. Her father used to say that a house built on bad ground was not a house. It was a promise you were making to disaster. So she dug. The first morning on the ridge, she drove her spade into the hillside before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks. The ground was cold, but not yet frozen. She had maybe 3 weeks before the frost went deep enough to make digging impossible. She worked in a long rectangle pressed against the natural curve of the slope, cutting back into the hill rather than building out from it. Della sat on a flat rock nearby, wrapped in the good wool blanket, watching. "Why are you digging into the mountain?" Della asked. "Because the mountain is warmer than the air," Marin said without stopping. "In winter, the earth 6 feet down stays close to 50 degrees, always. Doesn't matter what the air does above it." Della considered this. "Like a root cellar." "Exactly like a root cellar, except we're going to live in it." Della looked at the rectangle of disturbed earth. "That seems very small." "It will get bigger." It did get bigger, slowly, over the next 6 days. Marin dug in the mornings and hauled stone in the afternoons. Flat field stone from the creek bed below, carried up the ridge trail 2 and 3 at a time in a canvas pack she'd bought at the general store. Her back ached from the second day onward. Her hands blistered. Then the blisters hardened into calluses, which was the body's way of deciding to cooperate. On the 4th afternoon, she heard someone on the trail below. Garrett Calloway was the kind of man who announced himself by the sound of his boots. Heavy, deliberate, not bothering to be quiet. He ran the blacksmith forge at the south end of town, and he had the hands to prove it. Wide and scarred, and perpetually dark at the knuckles. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at what Marin was building with the expression of a man who has seen something genuinely confusing. "You're putting the back wall into the hill," he said. "I am. That's not how you build a house. It's how I'm building this one." Garrett looked at the stone foundation, the angle of the cut into the hillside, the way the back wall would sit flush against solid earth. He shook his head the way men shake their heads when they've already decided something is wrong and are simply confirming it. "Wind'll tear that roof off before Christmas," he said. Marin straightened up and looked at him. "The wind hits the front face and goes over the top. The hill behind takes the rest. I don't expect the roof to move at all." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the hill. Then he looked back at her with an expression that suggested the conversation was not worth continuing, turned around, and walked back down the trail. Myron watched him go, then went back to work. She had expected this. Small towns ran on consensus, on everyone agreeing about what was sensible and what wasn't, and then enforcing that agreement through 1,000 small daily pressures. A raised eyebrow at the general store. A particular silence at the church door. The way a conversation stopped when you walked past and started again when you were far enough away. She had been in Alder Creek for less than 2 weeks, and she already understood exactly how it worked. And she understood something else too, that understanding a system and being able to ignore it were two entirely different things. The betting pool appeared on the door of the general store on a Wednesday morning, written in Silas Ward's round, self-satisfied handwriting on a piece of brown paper. Whitfield's Folly. Place your bets. Before Thanksgiving. $2. Before Christmas. $5. Makes it to spring. Nobody's fool enough to bet that Maren saw it when she came down for supplies. She read it once, bought her flour and dried beans, and walked back up the ridge without a word. Della hadn't seen it. Maren made sure of that. Silas Ward was 24 years old and worked at the mine 3 days a week when the mine had work to give, which it increasingly didn't. He had the particular confidence of a young man who had never been seriously wrong about anything, mostly because he had never been seriously tested by anything. He laughed easily and loudly, and he had a following among the other young men in town who found his certainty reassuring. He came up the ridge trail that same afternoon with 2 of them, ostensibly to see how the construction was going, actually to have something to report back to the group at the general store. Boone growled before they were halfway up the trail. Maren hadn't intended to keep the dog. She had found him, or rather, Della had found him, at the dump at the edge of town 3 days after their arrival. He was a shepherd, a year old at most, maybe less, with a coat that had gone dull from poor feeding, and eyes that were too watchful for a dog that age. Someone had left him there with a length of rope still tied to his neck, the end frayed where he'd chewed through it. "We can't," Maren had said. "He's hungry," Della said. "So are we." "Mama." She had looked at the dog. The dog had looked back at her with an expression of profound and patient dignity that suggested he was not asking for charity, only for a reasonable chance. "One more mouth," Maren had said. Della had taken that as a yes, which it was. Now Boone stood at the edge of the cleared ground, hackles slightly raised, watching Silas and his companions come up the trail with the low, unhurried growl of a dog who has made a decision and is simply communicating it. "Friendly," Silas said, stopping. "He's fine," Maren said. "He just doesn't like people who come to laugh." Silas looked at her with the smile of someone who has been mildly insulted and is deciding whether to take offense or turn it into a joke. He chose the joke. He looked at the foundation, the stone walls beginning to rise, the angle of the back wall disappearing into the hillside. "You're burying the house in the mountain," he said. "Part of it, yes. What happens when the spring melt comes? All that water running down the hill? The stone channels it around the foundation. I've cut drainage lines on either side." Silas nodded with the exaggerated thoughtfulness of someone who has no intention of being persuaded. "And the roof? You're building the roof slope downhill?" "Toward the valley, yes. Snow'll pile up on the uphill side. The hill takes that weight. The roof only carries what falls directly on it." Silas looked at his companions. One of them shrugged. The other grinned. Silas turned back to Maren with the expression he probably thought was good-humored. "Well," he said, "least you'll have a warm grave when it collapses on you." He laughed. His companions laughed. Boone's growl deepened one register, and they left. Marin stood still for a moment after they were gone. Then she picked up her mallet and went back to setting stone. The night it almost ended was the 6th night on the ridge. She had known Della was getting sick from the afternoon. The particular quietness, the way the child sat too still on her rock, the glassiness behind her eyes that a mother learns to read the way her father had taught her to read stone. By evening, Della's forehead was hot under Marin's palm. By midnight, the thermometer Marin had brought in her trunk read 103 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 8 below zero. The cabin had no roof yet, only the walls, and a temporary canvas stretched across the top, which was keeping out the wind but not the cold. The fire in the small iron stove Marin had dragged up the ridge on a borrowed sled burned steady, and the stone walls held what warmth there was, but it was not enough. Not with a sick child. The doctor in Alder Creek was a man named Fielding who charged $3 for a house call and had made it quietly, but clearly understood that his services were for people living in the town proper, which the ridge was not. Marin had $2.60. She sat beside Della and thought through what she had. Her father's field notes were in the trunk, not medical, but she had read them so many times she knew which pages held the notes he'd made after her mother got sick, the winter Marin was 12. He had written down everything the old county healer had done, because he was a man who believed in documentation, even in a crisis. Willow bark for fever. Elderflower steeped in hot water, given in small sips, to promote sweating. Damp cloth on the forehead, changed every 10 minutes. She had willow bark. She had packed it from habit, from something her father had said once about always carrying what you can't buy. She had dried elderflower in a tin at the bottom of the supply crate. She had water heating on the stove. She worked through the night. She changed the cloth every 10 minutes until her arms ached from wringing it out in the cold water. She gave Della the elderflower tea in careful small doses, the way the notes said, watching to make sure she kept it down. She talked to her daughter in a low, steady voice. Not about anything important, just words. The names of the wildflowers her father had taught her, the types of rock in the creek bed below, the way to tell a Douglas fir from a ponderosa by the pattern of the bark. Della drifted in and out of sleep. Boone lay pressed against her side, steadying her through the long, cold hours. Around 4 in the morning, the fever broke. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no moment of crisis or resolution. Della simply stopped shivering, took a longer breath, and her forehead under Marin's hand went from burning to merely warm. Marin sat back on her heels. She went outside in the dark, wrapped in her coat, and sat on the flat rock at the edge of the clearing. The stars over Montana in October are not subtle. They press down close and cold and indifferent, the way only very old things can be indifferent. She sat under them and let herself shake for about 5 minutes, the delayed shaking of a body that has been holding itself rigid by force of will and is finally permitted to stop. Then she went back inside. Della opened her eyes just before dawn. "Did I miss anything?" she asked, her voice still rough. Marin laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out before she could stop it, genuine and a little ragged. "Not a thing," she said. "Go back to sleep." Old Fenwick arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into the build. without announcement and without explanation. He was 70 years old and built like a man who had spent a lifetime underground. Short, enormously wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been made from a different material than the rest of him. He was from Cornwall, England, originally, though he'd been in Montana for 30 years. He worked at the mine when it had work to give, which these days was less and less. He came up the ridge trail, looked at the stone Marin was setting into the back wall, and without a word walked over, crouched down, picked up the stone she'd just placed, and put it back differently. Rotated 90 degrees, fitted into a channel she hadn't seen. Cornwall miners build like this, he said. Friction fit. No mortar needed, but nothing shifts. He showed her twice. Then he stood up and looked at the wall. Works better, he said. Thank you, Marin said. He walked back down the trail without another word. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never explained himself, never arrived at a set time, never stayed more than an hour or two. He corrected her when she was wrong and said nothing when she was right. It was, Marin reflected, almost exactly how her father had taught, not by instruction, but by demonstration, by the quiet assumption that if you showed someone the right way, they had enough sense to follow it. Della called him Mr. Fenwick from the first day, and he accepted the title with a small, serious nod. Boone accepted him on the third day, which Marin considered the more meaningful endorsement. It was around this time that Everett Voss appeared. He came up the ridge trail on a Friday afternoon with a leather briefcase and the slightly out-of-place look of a man who spent most of his time indoors. He was 47 years old, with the kind of careful, precise face that suggested he chose his words the way a good carpenter chose wood, for fit and durability. He had been in Alder Creek for 3 years, running a one-man law practice out of a room above the general store. I heard you had a property purchase, he said. I'd like to look at your deed documentation, if you're willing. No charge. Marin looked at him. Why? He paused. Because the man at the county office has a way of reviewing deeds when someone complains about them, and I'd rather know what you have before that happens. Is someone complaining about them? Not yet, he said, but small towns have a way of running out of other things to talk about. She brought out the papers. He went through them carefully, standing at the makeshift work table she'd set up against the half-built wall, reading each page twice in the methodical way he had. Della watched him from across the room with the frank, evaluating gaze of an 8-year-old who has learned to pay attention to people her mother deals with. These are in order, he said finally. The estate sale documentation is clean. Chain of title goes back to 1903. I know, Marin said. I know you know, he said. I wanted to know too. He rolled the papers up, handed them back to her, and left without explaining further. Della waited until his footsteps had faded down the trail. He looked at you, she said. Everyone looks at me. I'm building a house in a hill. Not like that, Della said in the tone of someone reporting a fact rather than making an observation, and went back to writing on her piece of slate. Marin did not respond to this. She picked up her mallet and went back to work. But later, when the fire was low and Della was asleep and Boone had arranged himself across the door with the practiced solemnity of a dog who takes his responsibilities seriously, Marin sat for a moment and thought about the way Everett Voss had said, I wanted to know too. The small, careful emphasis on too, as though her knowing something made it worth his time to know it as well. She set the thought aside. There was too much to build. Marshall Cobb Pruitt arrived on a Thursday morning in early November, and everything changed. He was a heavy man, 55 years old, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent so long carrying official authority that he had confused it for personal weight. He rode up the ridge trail on a gray horse and dismounted at the edge of the clearing with the deliberate slowness of a man who wants to make sure you've had time to feel the significance of his arrival. He had a document in his hand. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Marshall," Marin said. She kept working. "I'll need you to stop what you're doing." She put down her tool, turned to face him. "Why?" He held out the document. "Formal notice of disputed ownership, filed by Harlan Whitfield of Billings, representing the estate of Thomas Whitfield, deceased. The claim states that this property was purchased using funds that constituted marital assets subject to estate division." Marin took the paper, read it. Her face stayed still. "That claim is false," she said. "This land was purchased from the county recorder using money I earned before my marriage. My own money." "That's for the court to determine," Pruitt said. He had the voice of a man who has said this particular sentence many times and has stopped listening to the responses. "Until the matter is resolved, construction must cease." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a second document, smaller, and held it out. "There's also the matter of residence suitability," he said. His voice dropped slightly, not from kindness, but from the particular tone used to deliver information that the speaker knows will land hard. "A woman living alone on an unsecured hillside with no fixed income and no family infrastructure. The court has the right to review the welfare of any dependent child in such circumstances." The word dependent sat in the cold air between them. Della was inside. Marin could hear the scratch of her slate pencil through the wall. "You're threatening to take my daughter," Marin said. "I'm informing you of legal processes," Pruitt said. "What you do with that information is your business." He remounted his horse, rode back down the ridge without looking back. That night, Marin sat at the small table long after Della had gone to sleep. The fire burned low. The stone wall behind the stove held its warmth the way she had designed it to hold warmth. Slowly, steadily, letting it go in measured amounts, rather than all at once. She had built it right. She knew she had built it right. She had $23 left, after supplies. She had a half-built cabin and a disputed land deed, and a child asleep in the corner. She had a father-in-law she had spoken to 40 times in her life who had decided, from a distance, to dismantle everything she was building. She had a pen. She had a blank piece of paper. One signature, and it was over. Marin Whitfield acknowledges the contested nature of the property claim and agrees to vacate pending legal resolution. Standard language. Harlan would probably even let her stay in the house in Billings, the house she'd been expelled from, until something was sorted out. Della would have a warm bedroom, a real school, regular meals. Marin picked up the pen. Boone raised his head and looked at her. She heard movement from the corner, the soft rustle of a child turning over in sleep. She looked. Della was sitting up. She had the piece of slate in her lap. She had been practicing her letters before bed and apparently fallen asleep holding it. She looked at her mother with eyes that were still half in sleep, and she held out the slate the way a person holds something out when they're not sure why they're doing it, only that it seems important. Marin looked at the slate. Della had been practicing 2 words for the past 3 days, over and over, getting the letters even and clear. Our house. Marin set down the pen. She sat very still for a long time. Then she folded the blank paper, put it back in the drawer, and set the pen beside it. In the morning, she went down the ridge and knocked on Everett Voss's door. He went through the chain of title in 2 hours. 1903, he said, not looking up from the county records he'd requested. Harlan Whitfield sold this parcel to a land speculator named Edmund Graves. Graves defaulted on his loans in 1909. The parcel went to estate sale in 1911. You purchased it from the estate. Harlan Whitfield had no legal interest in this property after 1903. Pruitt knows this, Marin said. Everett looked up then. Yes, he said. He knows. Then why? Because Harlan Whitfield sent him $40, Everett said. He said it the way you say something you verified and don't enjoy knowing. I can't prove it. But the timing of the filing and the specific language used, it's not standard county procedure. Someone wrote that custody language specifically to frighten you. The word frighten sat between them. Did it work? Everett asked. Marin thought about the pen in her hand, the blank paper, Della's slate. Not enough, she said. Everett Voss filed a counterclaim with the county that afternoon. The following week, a response came back from the county recorder's office. The original claim had insufficient legal basis to proceed. The disputed ownership notice was withdrawn. Marin read the letter twice, put it in the tin box she'd started keeping on the work table. Then she went back up the ridge and finished the roof. November arrived without ceremony. The days shortened. The temperature dropped in steady increments, 5 degrees one week, 8 the next. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but accumulates like debt until you realize one morning that the water in the bucket by the door has a skin of ice on it before you've had time to build the fire back up. Marin worked through it. The walls were the hardest part, not the hauling, which was merely physical, but the fitting. Each stone had to be chosen for its neighbors, had to fit the space it was going into the way a word fits a sentence, with precision and purpose. She developed an eye for it over the first 2 weeks, the way you develop an eye for anything you do enough times in close enough attention. She began to see the wall not as individual stones, but as a system, each piece supporting the ones above it and held by the ones below. Fenwick came most mornings. He said less as the weeks passed, which Marin took as a compliment. The corrections grew fewer and smaller, from that whole section needs to come out in the first week to that one stone, turn it in the third. By November, he mostly came and watched and occasionally handed her a tool before she reached for it, which was its own form of communication. Della kept her lessons going through all of it. She had organized her materials with the seriousness of a person who has decided that a thing worth doing is worth doing properly. The piece of slate for writing practice, her grandfather's geological notebook for reading aloud, a collection of creek stones she had labeled in her mother's handwriting and arranged on a wooden shelf Marin had cut from a pine board. She taught herself from the notebook and tested her understanding by explaining things to Boone, who listened with the attentive patience of a dog who has decided that whatever the child is doing, it is worth supporting. One afternoon in late October, Marin came in from the wall to find Della sitting cross-legged on the floor with the notebook open to a page of diagrams, explaining to Boone the difference between igneous and sedimentary rock. Igneous means it came from fire, Della said seriously. Boone's ears moved. Like this whole ridge. Grandpa wrote that the ridge above Alder Creek is basalt, which means it came up from inside the earth a very long time ago. She looked at Marin. Is that right? That's right, Marin said. And that's why the ridge is strong enough to build on. That's why, Marin said. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her daughter, 8 years old, sitting on a dirt floor in a half-built cabin in Montana, teaching herself geology from a dead man's notebook by explaining it to a dog, and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Something adjacent to gratitude, but larger than that. Something that had to do with continuity. For my lessons, Della said, and went back to the diagram. The community of women who quietly helped never announced themselves and never asked for acknowledgement. It began with Mrs. Aldine's neighbor, a woman named Pearl Holt, whose husband worked at the mine, who left a loaf of bread on the ridge trail one morning wrapped in a cloth. Marin found it on her way down to collect water. There was no note. A week later, a small crock of salt butter appeared in the same spot. The week after that, a jar of dried apples. Marin never saw who left these things. She never asked. She accepted them with the straightforward practicality of someone who understands that refusing help you genuinely need is not strength, but a kind of pride that her situation could not afford. She was grateful. She kept her gratitude private and went on working. The betting pool on the general store door was updated twice. First to remove the Thanksgiving deadline when Thanksgiving came and went, and Marin was still building. Then to remove the Christmas deadline when it became clear that was going to come and go as well. By November, the paper had faded and curled at the edges, and no one seemed particularly interested in maintaining it, which was, Marin supposed, a form of concession. The Reverend stopped her outside the general store one afternoon in early November. The same week Pruitt had arrived, though the Reverend did not know that, and told her, with what appeared to be genuine pastoral concern, that the Bible was full of warnings about pride, and that a woman building alone on a hillside in the face of community council was displaying the kind of willfulness that had not served humanity well historically. Marin listened to all of it. Then she said, "Thank you, Reverend," and went inside to buy her flour. She was not proud exactly. She was certain. Those were different things, though she understood why people who had not thought carefully about the distinction might confuse them. By late November, the cabin was complete. It didn't look like anything else in Alder Creek. From the valley, it was easy to miss entirely. The back half buried in the hillside, the roof sloped toward the valley at an angle that shed snow efficiently. The front face with its 2 windows looking out over the creek and the town below like a pair of quiet, watchful eyes. Inside, the stone wall behind the iron stove had been built 18 inches thick, and the earth packed hard against the exterior of that wall went back 6 feet into the hillside. On the first truly cold night, December, temperature dropping to -15, Marin sat inside and watched the thermometer. 49 degrees, with only a moderate fire. She had known it would work. She had run the calculations in her father's notebooks, traced the logic through his field notes, felt the correctness of it in the way you feel the correctness of something when the knowledge is genuinely yours rather than borrowed. But knowing a thing and seeing it proven are different experiences. She sat for a while and let herself feel the difference. Della came and sat beside her, looking at the thermometer. "Mama," she said after a while, Are we poor? Marin looked around the cabin, the neat shelf of supplies against the left wall, the tin of elderflower and willow bark and 3 other medicinal herbs, the 2 wool blankets folded at the end of the sleeping platform, the piece of slate that said "Our House" now nailed into the wall above the door, Boone asleep by the stove, one ear twitching in a dream. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Della thought about this with the serious thoroughness she brought to most questions. "Okay," she said, and went back to her letters. Outside, the first hard snow of December was beginning to fall. Down in the valley, 28 chimneys sent their smoke straight up into the still air. Everything was quiet. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. But what Marin didn't know, couldn't have known, sitting warm in her finished cabin while the snow came down, was that Marshall Cobb Pruitt had not given up. He had simply changed his approach, and his next move would be far more dangerous than any piece of paper. The snow that fell in December was ordinary snow. It came in the way Montana winters usually began, patient and methodical, covering the valley floor in clean white layers, filling the creek banks, rounding the sharp edges of fence posts and wagon wheels until the whole town looked like something made from memory rather than wood and stone. People shoveled their paths, stacked extra firewood against their walls, and went about the business of winter the way people do when they have done it many times before and expect to do it many times again. Marin watched the snow from her window and thought about the ridgeline above town. She had been watching it since October. Every morning she climbed the flat rock beside the cabin with the brass spyglass that had been her husband's. One of the few things she'd kept, not for sentiment, but because it was useful. And she studied the upper snowpack the way her father had taught her to study anything worth understanding. Slowly, without deciding what she was seeing before she had finished looking. The fracture lines had appeared in early December. Not cracks exactly. More like seams, long and pale, running across the face of the upper snowpack where the new snow sat against the old. Her father had drawn pictures of exactly this in his field notes. He had written beside them in his small, careful hand. When you see this, the question is not whether. The question is when. Marin had read those notes so many times that she knew which page the drawings were on without looking. She said nothing to anyone. Not yet. She was still the woman who had built a house in a hill. Whatever she said would be heard through that lens first, and through its actual meaning second, if at all. She watched the lines, and she waited, and she went on building her life. It was Della who found out about Silas. She had gone down to the general store on a Thursday afternoon in early January for flour and salt, the usual errand, Boone walking beside her with the serious proprietary air he adopted whenever Marin wasn't present. Della was 8 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that made adults forget she was in the room, which she had learned to use without entirely understanding that she was using it. She was looking at the tins on the back shelf when she heard Silas Ward's voice from the other side of the tall shelving unit. He was talking to a man whose voice she didn't recognize, a heavier voice, older, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. Signed statement saying the structure is unsound. Wall built into a hillside, no proper foundation inspection, no permit from the county office. There's no permit requirement for residential builds outside town limits, Silas said. He sounded different than usual, less certain. The way a person sounds when they're performing confidence rather than feeling it. There will be by February, the older voice said. I've already spoken to the county commissioner. And with your statement, we have grounds to petition the court for a welfare review. A child living in an unsound structure. How much? Silas said. A pause. $15, the older voice said. Della stood very still behind the shelving unit. Boone pressed against her leg, sensing something, his nose working the air. Fine, Silas said. Della bought her flour and her salt and walked home up the ridge trail at a pace slightly faster than usual, and she told her mother everything she had heard in the order that she had heard it, which was one of the things Marin had taught her. When something matters, you tell it in order, not in the order of what seems most important, because sometimes you don't know yet which part is most important. Marin listened without interrupting. When Della finished, Marin sat for a moment. Boone sat down and looked at her. The man with the older voice, Marin said. Did you see him? No, but I heard his boots when he left. He had spurs. Marin thought about the only man she knew who wore spurs in January in a town this size, Marshall Cobb Pruitt. She went down to the general store the following morning. Silas was there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, talking to two of his usual companions. He saw Marin come through the door, and his expression did something complicated. Not quite guilt, because guilt requires a prior sense of obligation, but something adjacent to it. A flicker of awareness, quickly suppressed. Marin walked to the counter, bought nothing, and turned to face him directly. I know what you agreed to, she said. The store went quiet. Silas set his coffee down. The certainty came back into his face. The performed kind. The kind that needs an audience. Don't know what you're talking about. $15 for a signed statement saying my cabin is structurally unsound. The two companions looked at each other. The store owner found something to do behind the counter. It's just business, Silas said. He smiled, which was the wrong choice. Nothing personal, Mrs. Whitfield. It's my daughter, Marin said. Her voice was level, not loud, not theatrical, just precise, the way her father had been precise when something genuinely mattered. You are helping a man take my daughter from me. That is what you are being paid to do. I want you to understand that I understand that completely. The smile went away. Garrett Calloway was in the store. He was standing near the window, a coil of iron wire over one arm, and he had heard everything. Marin looked at him. Garrett looked back at her for a moment, and then he looked at the floor, and turned, and walked out the door. Marin watched him go. She had thought in recent weeks that Garrett Calloway was beginning to see things differently. He had stopped making comments about the cabin. He had nodded to her once on the ridge trail in a way that seemed to acknowledge something beyond basic courtesy. She had not been certain what to make of it, but she had noticed it. Now she knew what it was worth. She walked back up the ridge without speaking to anyone else. That evening, for the first time since she had set down the pen in November, Marin sat with the weight of the situation and let herself feel it fully. Pruitt was not finished. Harlan Whitfield's money was still working, still finding new angles, still trying to locate the particular pressure point that would make her give up. The property claim hadn't worked. So now it was the cabin's structure. And when that didn't work, it would be something else. The man had patience and someone else's money and no particular stake in her daughter's welfare one way or the other, and she was alone. Old Fenwick was reliable and skilled, and she trusted him more than she trusted most people in this town. But he was 70 years old and not a legal person, and had no standing in any proceeding Pruitt might initiate. Everett Voss had handled the property claim efficiently and without fuss, and she was grateful for it. But gratitude and dependence were different things, and she was not in the habit of the second. She was alone, and the cold was deepening, and the fracture lines on the upper snowpack were getting longer. She went to the window and looked up at the ridge in the dark. She couldn't see the lines at night, but she knew where they were. It was old Fenwick who changed things. He came up the trail the following morning and found her on the flat rock with the spyglass, looking at the upper snowpack the way she had been doing every morning for 2 months. He stood beside her without speaking, the way he usually stood, waiting until she had finished looking. She lowered the spyglass. "It's getting longer," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You see it too." It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "I've seen this before," he said. "Not here. Cornwall. Before I came to America. There was a hillside above a mining camp. Same kind of line. The foreman said it was settling." He paused. "It wasn't settling. What happened?" "Everyone in the low ground lost everything." He said it the way very old people sometimes say terrible things, flatly, because they have had long enough to absorb the weight of it. A woman had tried to warn them. She'd been watching the hill for weeks. She'd left something behind in the rock, notes, a drawing. "I've been watching to see if you'd find it yourself. Up here." Marin went still. "What do you mean, find it yourself?" Fenwick looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face of a man deciding how much to say, and arriving at the conclusion that the time for partial information had passed. "When I came to Alder Creek," he said slowly, "I came because I had been in this valley before. 30 years ago. There was a woman here then. She had seen the same lines, the same snowpack. She had started to build up on this ridge, the same way you're building." He paused. She didn't finish. Marin's voice was very quiet. "What was her name?" "Eleanor," he said. "Eleanor Fenwick." The name landed in the cold air between them. "Your wife," Marin said. "My wife." He looked out over the valley. "She died before the second winter. The cabin was half built. I came back to finish it. But by the time I got back, someone had bought the parcel. And then it sat empty for 30 years. He looked at Marin. "Until you." "And she left something behind," Marin said. "In the rock." "I believe so. I've been waiting to see if you'd find it." Marin thought about the tin box she'd noticed 3 weeks ago, nailed behind the iron stove, in the seam between the back wall and the stone of the hillside. She had assumed it was a previous owner's storage. A habit of old buildings, small containers tucked into corners. She had not opened it. She looked at Fenwick. He looked back at her, with the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time, and can afford to be patient a little longer. "Go on then," he said. She went home. She moved the stove 6 inches to the left. The tin box was there, exactly where she had noticed it. Small, rusted at the edges, nailed into the stone with 3 iron nails that had gone dark with age. She worked it free. The nails gave way slowly, then suddenly, with a sound like a small, held breath. She set the box on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. The paper had gone the color of weak tea. The handwriting was a woman's, careful and deliberate, each letter pressed firmly into the page. Maren unfolded it and read, "I built the first one wrong, and the mountain taught me how to do it right." 3 winters watching these lines before I understood what they meant. The fracture runs from the eastern spur to the notch above the creek. When the line reaches the notch, you have perhaps 4 days. The path of the slide is straight down the valley floor. Everything in the low ground will go. The cabin on the ridge will hold if the back wall is properly seated into the hill and the roof beams are sized for pressure from above. I have written the measurements on the back of this paper. If you are reading this, you built it right. The earth never lies. E. Fenwick, November 1887. Maren sat with the paper in her hands for a long time. She turned it over. On the back, in the same careful hand, were measurements, beam dimensions, wall thickness, the exact depth the back wall needed to be set into the hillside to withstand what was coming. She had hit every number correctly, not by coincidence, by reading the same ground, the same stone, through the same knowledge her father had given her. Eleanor Fenwick had read it too. 30 years apart, 2 women had looked at the same hill and come to the same conclusions, and built the same thing, and understood the same truth. The earth never lies. Maren set the paper down. She was aware of something moving through her that she didn't have a simple word for. It wasn't comfort exactly, and it wasn't grief exactly, though it had elements of both. It was more like recognition. The specific feeling of realizing you are not, in fact, the first person to have stood exactly where you are standing. She folded the paper carefully and put it back in the tin box. Then she went outside to look at the ridge. The fracture line had reached the eastern spur. She stood on the flat rock with the spyglass and measured it against the landmark she had been tracking for weeks. The line ran long and pale across the upper snowpack, and the eastern end of it had extended in the last 48 hours to within 2 miles of the notch above the creek. When the line reaches the notch, you have perhaps 4 days. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went down into the valley. She started with Mrs. Aldine, who was the oldest person in Alder Creek, and the one most likely to have a frame of reference for what Maren was describing. Mrs. Aldine was 75 years old and had been in this valley for 40 years and had the particular credibility of someone who has outlasted most of the things that were supposed to outlast her. Mrs. Aldine listened to everything Maren said, looked at the drawing Maren had made of the fracture line's position. Then she looked out her window toward the ridge. "I've heard of avalanches in the upper range," she said slowly. "This isn't the upper range," Maren said. "This is directly above the valley floor." Mrs. Aldine looked at the drawing again for a long time. "I'll think on it," she said, which was not a yes, but it was not quite a no either. And from Mrs. Aldine, Maren had learned to measure these things carefully. The doctor, Fielding, listened with professional patience, and then told her, also with professional patience, that animals did not reliably predict weather patterns and that snowpack fracture lines were common winter features that did not necessarily indicate instability. "The snow has been sitting up there for 20 years without sliding," he said. "I've been in this valley for 12 of those years. I have not observed any indication of unusual instability." "With respect," Maren said, "I'm not asking you to have observed it. I'm asking you to consider that I have." Fielding looked at her the way doctors sometimes looked at patients who had come to their own conclusions before the appointment. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, which was the medical profession's way of ending a conversation. She went to Garrett next. He was at the forge, working a piece of iron, and he heard her out without stopping. When she finished, he set down his hammer and looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He looked at the anvil, then at the wall, then at something that wasn't in the room. "People are already saying you're trying to get everyone to move up to the ridge," he said. "So they'll have to use your building methods. Or so you can claim some kind of, I don't know, authority." "That's what people are saying," Marin said. "I'm not saying I believe it. But you're not saying you don't." He picked up his hammer again. "I don't know what to believe, Mrs. Whitfield." She stood there for a moment, looking at the side of his face. She had liked Garrett Calloway, in a limited way, for the last several months. Liked his directness, the way he didn't waste words, the way he worked without posturing. She had thought, increasingly, that he was a man who was capable of honesty when honesty cost something. She was less certain of that now. She went to the church. The Reverend heard her out with folded hands and then reminded her that meteorological prediction was an imprecise science and that placing too much faith in animal behavior and geological observation over practical experience was a form of presumption that had led good people astray before. "Only God knows what the mountain will do," he said. "God and my father's field notes," Marin said, and left before he could respond. She went to the town meeting that the mayor held on the second Thursday of every month, and she stood up and said what she had seen and what she believed it meant, and she said it clearly and without embellishment, the way her father had always said things worth saying, without decoration, because decoration implied that the thing itself wasn't enough, and the thing itself was. She had brought the drawing. She had brought Eleanor Fenwick's measurements, which confirmed the avalanche path exactly. She had brought 2 pages from her father's field notes on snowpack instability, annotated in his small, careful hand. She laid them on the table at the front of the meeting room and waited while the people of Alder Creek looked at them. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Silas Ward stood up. "The mole woman is scared of sunshine," he said. The room laughed. Not everyone. Not Mrs. Aldine, who sat very still near the back with her eyes on the drawings on the table, and not Everett Voss, who was watching Marin with an expression she didn't have time to interpret, but enough. Enough that the sound of it filled the room and made her warning smaller and easier to dismiss. Marin looked at the laughing faces. She thought about Eleanor Fenwick standing in a room very much like this one, 30 years ago, with the same information and the same result. She gathered her papers and her coat and walked out. The drawings she left on the table. Someone would look at them eventually. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe never. She had done what she could do. The rest was not in her hands. 3 days later, the line reached the notch. Marin saw it in the morning, through the spyglass, in the thin, early light. The eastern end of the fracture had extended through the night, slowly, then not slowly, the way these things went. And the pale seam now ran from the spur all the way to the notch above the creek, one continuous line across the face of the upper snowpack like a scar across pale skin. She lowered the spyglass. 4 days, perhaps, or perhaps less. She went inside. Della was awake, sitting with her slate, Boone pressed against her side. Boone was not relaxed this morning. He had been pacing since before dawn, moving from the door to the window to the door again, unable to settle. Della was watching him with the careful attention of a child who had learned to pay attention to the things her mother paid attention to. "What's wrong with Boone?" Della asked. "He knows something is coming," Marin said. "The storm?" "More than a storm." She went to the cellar and checked the stores. Beans, flour, salt pork, dried apples, potatoes. She had been building the cellar stores since October, partly from habit, partly from the calculations she'd been running in her head since she first saw the fracture lines. How many people might need shelter? How long they might need it? She had never told anyone she was doing this. She had simply done it. She went back upstairs, checked the roof beams, all solid, all sized to Eleanor Fenwick's specifications, which were her own specifications. Checked the stone wall behind the stove, pressed her palm flat against it, and felt the deep, stored warmth it held. Checked the window shutters, the door beam, the drainage lines she'd cut on either side of the cabin's foundation. Everything was as ready as she could make it. She went back to the window one more time and looked down at the valley. 28 lives down there. 28 families who had built their homes on flat ground near water, the way people had always built their homes on flat ground near water. Because that was what you did. Because that was where the good soil was, and the creek was close, and the hauling was manageable. And no one had ever told them that the flat ground near the water was exactly where the mountain sent its snow when it finally had enough. She thought, I am not doing this to be right. I am doing this because it is true. And because true things have consequences whether or not anyone acknowledges them. And because the consequences of this particular truth would arrive whether she warned anyone or not. She had warned them. She had done what she could do. The rest was the mountain's business. Outside, the sky had begun to change. It happened slowly, and then all at once, the way certain irreversible things happen. The blue-gray of the morning sky shifted toward something yellower, something with a bruised undertone, the color her father had written about in his field notes in the margin of a page about high-pressure weather systems. This color means run. The wind dropped to nothing. In her experience, silence before a Montana storm was not peaceful. It was the silence of something very large, drawing breath. Boone stopped pacing. He sat down in the center of the floor, facing the door, and did not move again. "Mama," Della said quietly. "I know," Marin said. She went to the window and looked down at the valley one last time. 28 chimneys, smoke going straight up in the dead still air, small figures moving between buildings, a wagon being unloaded outside the general store. Everything exactly as it always was, everyone going about the business of a Thursday afternoon in January, trusting that the world would continue to behave the way it had always behaved. She watched them for a moment. Then she went and put more wood on the fire, and she sat down with her daughter, and she waited for what was coming. It came just after dark. Not the avalanche. Not yet. First came the storm itself, rolling down from the upper range with a speed that suggested it had been building for a long time and had finally run out of patience. The wind hit the cabin like a physical object, a wall of pressure that made the front windows shudder in their frames. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. Marin checked the thermometer inside the cabin. 47 degrees. The stone wall was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Outside, she could hear the wind, not howling. That word was too gentle for what it was. Screaming. A high, continuous, furious sound, like something alive and enraged, throwing itself against every surface it encountered. Snow drove horizontal past the windows, visibility dropping to nothing within minutes. The first knock came an hour after dark. She had been expecting it. She had been expecting it for 4 days, if she was honest with herself. She had not let herself think about it too directly. There was a version of expectation that hardened into something ungenerous, something that wanted to be right more than it wanted people to be safe, and she had been careful to keep her distance from that version. She went to the door. Garrett Calloway stood in the doorway with his wife and 2 children, snow in his beard and ice on his eyelashes, the family's 2 blankets bundled under one arm. The roof of their cabin, he would tell her later, had not collapsed. It had simply separated from the walls, lifted clean off by a gust that he estimated at 60 or 70 miles an hour, there and gone in under a second. He looked at Maren. He had been carrying something in his expression all the way up the ridge. She could see that. Something he had prepared to say, some version of acknowledgement or apology or both. But when he actually stood in the doorway looking at her, the words seemed to lose their shape. "Come in," Maren said. "Get warm." They came in. More knocks followed. Mrs. Aldine brought up the trail by 2 young miners who had gone to get her when they saw her roof beginning to go. A family of 5 from the east end of town, children wrapped in curtains because they hadn't had time to find their coats. The Reverend, alone, his hat gone, his face white with cold, and something that might have been a particular kind of reckoning. Silas Ward came without looking at anyone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, snow-covered, and then stepped inside and moved to the far corner and sat down on the floor and did not speak. The last knock came when the storm had been going for 3 hours and the snow outside was already above the windowsills. Maren opened the door. Marshall Cobb Pruitt stood alone in the howling dark. His coat was torn at one shoulder. His hat was gone. He was 60 yards from shelter, and he had clearly been fighting the wind for some time. And the particular authority he carried in his body, the weight of official standing that he wore like a second coat, was entirely absent. He was just a man in a storm, cold and alone, and far from anywhere safe. He looked at her. Maren held the door open. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. She closed the door against the wind. 41 people, now in a space built for 2. The fire in the stove burned steady, and the stone wall behind it radiated warmth in slow, even waves. And the roof beams, sized to Eleanor Fenwick's specifications, her own specifications, held the weight of the accumulating snow without complaint. Later, when the storm had quieted enough for conversation, Della pressed close to Maren's side and asked very quietly, "Will they be okay? The people who laughed at us?" Maren looked at the room. Garrett with his children asleep across his lap. Mrs. Aldine sitting straight-backed near the stove. Silas in his corner, staring at his hands. Pruitt near the door, a blanket someone had given him around his shoulders. "Yes," Maren said. "That's why we built it big enough." She had not yet opened the tin box again. That would come later, in the deepest part of the night, when the fire was low and most of the 41 people in the cabin were finally sleeping. She would take out the paper, unfold it carefully, and read the last line again by the light of a single candle. And she would look up and find old Fenwick watching her from across the room. And he would tell her, for the first time, his wife's full name. The storm lasted 3 days. Not 3 days of constant fury. It came in waves, the way the worst Montana winters always did, easing for a few hours in the night and then returning with renewed force before dawn, as though it had stepped back only to remember what it was doing. By the second morning, the snow outside the cabin windows had risen high enough to block the lower half of the glass entirely. The valley below had disappeared. 41 people learned to exist in a space built for two. They learned it the way people learn most necessary things, imperfectly, with friction, and then gradually, with something approaching grace. The first hours were the hardest. People were still in the physical shock of the storm, of the running and the cold and the thing they had seen the mountain do to their town. And shock makes people either very still or very loud, and a room with so many people in it had both kinds. Children cried. Men stood against the walls with the particular uselessness of people who are accustomed to being able to fix things and have encountered something unfixable. Women held children that weren't theirs, which was the instinct that organized the room before anything else did. Maren moved through all of it without stopping. She did not announce herself. She did not call for attention or declare herself in charge of anything. She simply began doing what needed doing. And because she was the only person in the room who had spent the last 3 months thinking about exactly this situation, the cabin, the winter storm, the cellar of supplies, she was the only person who knew what the next thing was. The first thing was the children. She counted them. 11. She moved them to the area near the stove, not closest to the fire, but near the stone wall, where the radiant heat was steady and even and wouldn't burn. She distributed the 2 spare blankets from the chest at the foot of the sleeping platform, tearing the larger one into sections with her sewing shears. Someone objected to the tearing. She couldn't see who in the crowded room, and she kept cutting without responding, because the objection was about the blanket, and the problem was about the children, and those were not the same problem. The second thing was the floor space. She assigned it without asking permission, which was the only way to assign floor space to so many people who had each arrived with their own idea of where they should be. Families together along the left wall, single men along the right, the elderly and the very young near the center, closest to the stone wall's warmth. She used the same logic she used for everything, not what was comfortable or politically convenient, but what the actual conditions required. Garrett Calloway helped her. He didn't ask what to do. He watched her for about 10 minutes and then began doing the thing she was about to do next, which was moving the furniture to the walls to clear the center of the floor. They worked in parallel for the better part of an hour, and by the time the room was arranged, the worst of the initial chaos had subsided into something that resembled, at least, managed difficulty. The third thing was the food. She opened the cellar trapdoor and went down alone with a lantern, and she stood in front of the shelves and did the arithmetic she had been doing in her head since October. The beans would stretch. The salt pork was the constraint, not enough for full portions across 5 days, but enough for meaningful portions across 3 if she was careful. She was careful. She came back up and began organizing the first meal. Hot water with dried beans and a small amount of salt pork, A broth more than a stew, but hot and substantial, and something the body could use after hours of cold and fear. She did it on the small iron stove without assistance until Mrs. Aldine appeared at her elbow and picked up the second pot without a word and began doing exactly what Marin was doing. Mrs. Aldine was 75 years old and had been running kitchens for 60 of those years. They did not talk much. They didn't need to. It was on the second night that the cabin became something more than shelter. The storm had settled into its middle phase, not the initial violence, but the sustained, grinding cold that followed it, the wind pressing steadily against the front face of the cabin, the temperature outside dropping below -40. Inside, the stone wall held at 49 degrees. Not comfortable, but safe. People had begun to sleep in shifts. Those awake in the middle hours of the night found themselves in the particular intimacy of shared darkness, the kind that makes conversation possible in ways that daylight doesn't. It was in this context that Silas Ward's son, a boy of 5 named Thomas, who had not spoken since the moment he watched his family's cabin roof separate from its walls and disappear into the storm, made his way across the sleeping bodies on the floor and sat down beside Boone. Boone was stationed near the eastern wall, in the place he had chosen on the first night, and returned to with the consistency of a dog who understands that a position, once taken, should be maintained. He was awake. He was almost always awake when the room was not fully settled. The boy sat down beside him. He did not say anything. He put his hand on Boone's side, over the slow rise and fall of the dog's breathing, and he stayed there. Boone did not move. He turned his head once to look at the child, then turned it back to face the room, and the boy's hand moved with the rhythm of his breathing, and after a while, the boy's eyes closed. Silas was awake. He had been awake, Marin suspected, for most of both nights. He saw his son cross the room, and he watched the whole thing happen. The hand on the dog's side, the slow settling, the eyes closing. And something in his face changed, in the way that faces change when something that has been held rigid for a long time is finally permitted to relax. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His shoulders moved once. He did not look at Marin. She did not look at him. She looked at the fire. Later, much later, when the boy had been moved back to sleep beside his mother and Boone had resumed his watch, Silas crossed the room and crouched down beside Marin where she sat against the wall. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a 24-year-old man who had spent most of the last year being certain about things he was no longer certain about. "I'm sorry," he said. "The betting pool. The things I said. The Pruitt." He stopped. All of it. Marin looked at him. He was young. She had known he was young, but she saw it clearly now in the way his face held its remorse. Openly, without the protective layering that older people develop. Young enough that this might actually change him, if he let it. "I know," she said. "That's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's a start." He nodded, went back to his corner, sat down beside his sleeping son, and put his hand lightly on the boy's back, the same gesture the boy had made with Boone, without knowing he was making it. Garrett came to her on the second night, after midnight, when most of the room was finally sleeping. He crossed the room quietly and sat against the wall beside her. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who are deciding how to say what they have. "I knew," Garrett said finally. Low voice, not looking at her. Murren waited. About the deed. When Pruitt came the second time, the custody language, the structural complaint, I knew the deed was clean. Everett had told me back in November. He'd told me because he thought I might. Garrett stopped. He thought I might say something, use my standing in town to push back. But you didn't, Murren said. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Harlan Whitfield's lawyer had a lien on my brother's land in Billings. Old debt, legitimate debt, but Harlan had bought it from the original creditor. He'd let me know, indirectly, through Pruitt, that the lien would be called in if I caused trouble. Your brother's land, Murren said. His family has been on that land for 20 years. Murren looked at the fire. The stone wall behind the stove ticked quietly as it expanded in the heat, the particular sound of a thing doing what it was built to do. I've known for weeks, she said. She heard him draw a slow breath. How? Because you stopped laughing before anyone else did, and men only stop laughing when they start feeling guilty. She paused. And because Everett told me. Not about your brother's land. He didn't know that part. But he told me he'd spoken to you. And you didn't. What would I have said? You made a choice that protected your family. I made a choice that protected mine. She looked at him. I didn't need you to save me, Garrett. I needed you not to help them destroy me. Those are different things. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't do enough, he said finally. No, she said. But you're here now. He nodded. After a while, he said, The forge is still standing. I know. Stone walls and uphill ground. He said it to himself, quietly, like a man memorizing something. I'll help you teach it. When we rebuild. Whatever you need, materials, labor, whatever I can do. I know you will, she said. Get some sleep. He went back across the room and lay down beside his family and closed his eyes. She watched him for a moment. A big, capable, imperfect man who had failed her in a specific way and acknowledged it without excuse and offered what he had, and thought that this was, perhaps, the most she had ever expected of anyone. Not perfection, not courage that cost nothing, just the willingness, eventually, to stop looking at the floor. It was enough. It was more than enough. She sat alone in the dim room and listened to 41 people breathe, and to the wind outside pressing against the cabin's front face and being turned away by the hill, and to the stone wall ticking steadily behind the stove as it released the warmth it had been storing since October. She thought about what she would do first, after the storm. She would find Fenwick. She would check that he was all right. She would begin planning the rebuild. She would teach everyone who was willing to be taught, starting with the ones who had laughed the loudest, because those were the ones who needed it most and would remember it longest. She would do all of this, and she would do it without anger and without pride, because neither anger nor pride built anything that lasted. She had learned that from her father and from Eleanor Fenwick, and from the stone wall behind the stove, and from the mountain itself, which had no opinions about any of them and simply did what it did, and would go on doing it long after everyone in this room was gone. The earth never lies. It just waits for someone with the patience to listen. Della spent the second day doing what she had always done when she wasn't sure what else to do. She taught. She gathered 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 7, near the eastern wall where the light was best and set her piece of slate between them and began reading aloud from the small book of her grandfather's geological notes that her mother kept on the shelf. She explained the words she knew and admitted plainly the ones she didn't, which made the children trust her more than they would have if she'd pretended to know everything. One of the 6-year-olds, a girl named Ruth, looked at the dense handwriting in the notebook and said, "Your grandpa wrote really small." "He had a lot to say," Della said. "Is your mama really a mole woman?" the same girl asked. Della didn't miss a beat. "No, she's the woman who saved your life tonight." Ruth thought about this for a moment, then nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking at the drawings of rock strata. By the third morning, 4 more children had joined the group. Della had organized them by age and interest. The younger ones listened while she read. The older ones practiced their letters on the back of her slate while she explained diagrams. It was not a school. It was something more improvised than that, and more necessary. Maren watched it from across the room and thought about her father, who had believed that knowledge was the only thing a person could carry without it growing heavier, that you could lose a house and keep what you knew, that the transfer of knowledge from one person to another was the closest thing to permanence the world had to offer. He had been right. He had been right about most things, which was one of the things she missed most about him. Not the comfort of having someone to tell her what to do, but the particular pleasure of being in the presence of someone whose judgment she trusted completely. She thought about Eleanor Fenwick, who had pressed those measurements into paper and nailed them into stone so that whoever came next would have what she had learned. That was knowledge passed forward across death and time, arriving exactly when it was needed. That was what Della was doing, in a small way, in the corner of the cabin with a piece of slate and a group of children who had lost their homes. She was doing exactly what was needed. The third night brought the birth. Maren had known it was coming since the afternoon. She had noticed the signs the way her mother had taught her to notice them. The particular quality of a woman's stillness and the specific way she was breathing. And she had quietly rearranged the sleeping space near the east wall to give Margaret Holt more room, without announcing why. Margaret was 23 years old, and this was her first child, and the child had decided that the third night of a major blizzard in a crowded mountain cabin was an entirely appropriate moment to arrive. Maren had delivered 2 babies before, once with her mother guiding her through it, and once alone, for a neighbor, when the doctor hadn't made it in time. She knew what she was doing, which was the most important thing about doing it. She sent everyone who didn't need to be there to the other side of the room. Mrs. Aldine stayed. Everett Voss positioned himself near the stove and kept the water hot without being asked, moving with the quiet, practical efficiency that Maren had come to rely on without quite deciding to. It was not easy. It was not quick. But Margaret Holt was strong and determined, and the cabin was warm, 49 degrees in the third night of a Montana blizzard, warm enough for what was needed. And just before dawn on the third day, the child arrived. The sound of a baby crying in that cabin at that hour was something that no one in the room forgot for the rest of their lives. The silence before it, the held collective breath of everyone in the dark. And then the cry, sudden and clear and furiously alive. And then the sound of the whole room exhaling. "A girl," Mrs. Aldine said. Margaret held her daughter and looked at her and said, without looking up, "Hope. Her name is Hope." "Because that's what she is," someone said from across the room. and no one disagreed. Maren stepped back. Everett was beside her. She hadn't heard him cross the room, but he was there, and she was aware of being very tired in a way she hadn't permitted herself to feel until just this moment, the tiredness of someone who has been holding a great deal up for a great deal of time, and has just been given a moment to set it down. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers. She let him. Della, from her corner of the room, opened one eye, observed this, and closed it again with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. Outside, the storm was ending. Maren could hear it in the way the wind had changed. Not softer exactly, but lower in register. The high shrieking gone. What remained something more like the steady exhale of a weather system that has finished what it came to do. The snow against the upper windows had stopped moving. The temperature inside the cabin held at 47 degrees. She went to the window in the hour before dawn and stood looking at the darkness outside. She thought about Eleanor Fenwick, about the note she had read 3 nights ago in this same room, by the light of a single candle, with Fenwick watching from across the crowded space. If you are reading this, you built it right. She had built it right, not perfectly. There were things she would do differently if she built it again, refinements she had noted over 3 years of living in it and observing what it did in different conditions. But right, essentially, foundationally right, in the way that mattered when it mattered most. Eleanor Fenwick had built the first one wrong and let the mountain teach her. Then she had put everything she'd learned into a box and nailed it into the wall and trusted that whoever came next would be able to use it. Maren had been whoever came next. She looked at the darkness outside the window and thought about that, about the long chain of it, knowledge moving from person to person across time, the earth's language spoken and learned and spoken again, one woman reading the same ground as another woman 30 years before, and arriving at the same answers because the answers were in the ground and the ground didn't change. Behind her, the baby cried once and settled. The stone wall ticked in the heat. The earth never lies, Maren thought. It just waits for someone who speaks the language. She stood at the window until the first pale light appeared above the eastern ridge, and then she turned back to the room, to the sleeping families and the cold stiffened blankets, and the baby named Hope, and the dog keeping watch by the eastern wall. And she began preparing breakfast, because the storm was ending. And what came after a storm was not rest. What came after a storm was the work of rebuilding, which was harder and slower and more permanent than surviving, and which would require everything she had learned and everything Eleanor Fenwick had left behind, and everything her father had given her before that. The dawn came up clean and cold, and absolute over the Montana ridge. Maren Whitfield put water on to boil and began. The storm left behind a silence that felt permanent. On the first morning after, Maren opened the cabin door and stood in the frame and looked at what the mountain had done. The sky was the pale, absolute blue that only appears over Montana after a major storm has spent itself completely, a color that has no ambiguity in it, no weather left to offer, nothing but cold, clear light pressing down on a changed world. The valley of Alder Creek was gone, not damaged, not disrupted, gone. The avalanche had come through the night of the first storm, while the people slept warm in the cabin on the ridge, and it had moved through the valley floor the way a river moves through soft ground. Not violently, exactly, but with complete indifference to what was in its path. The debris field stretched from the base of the upper cliffs all the way to the far bend of the creek. Compacted ice and broken timber, and the compressed remains of 26 buildings, smoothed over by 2 days of subsequent snowfall into something that looked almost peaceful from a distance. Almost. Garrett came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. Maren let him look. There are things a person needs to see fully before they can begin to think about what comes next, and this was one of them. 26 buildings, he said finally. 26, she said. The forge is still standing. Stone walls and uphill ground. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I should have listened. Yes, she said, not unkindly. The way you confirm a true thing. He reached into his coat and held out a folded paper. She took it. The deed documentation for her land, notarized with a second document attached. A formal witness statement signed by Garrett Calloway, confirming clear title and uncontested occupancy. He had gone to Everett Voss on the second day of the storm, she would learn later, before the snow had even begun to ease, and asked what he could do. This was what he could do. He had done it. She folded the papers and put them in her coat pocket. We need to talk about the rebuild, she said, when you're ready. I'm ready now, he said. The apologies came in different shapes, which was right, because the people of Alder Creek were different people and had done different things, and the accounting for each of them had its own particular weight and form. Mrs. Aldine left a jar of preserved plums on the cabin step on the fourth day, set it down without knocking, and was already halfway down the ridge trail when Maren opened the door. Maren called after her. The old woman raised one hand without turning. That was all, and it was enough. The gesture of someone who has understood something late and is not going to make a speech about it, only quietly adjust. The Reverend came on a Sunday, formally, hat in his hands, and said that he had mistaken certainty for wisdom and was sorry for it. He asked to use the forge for services until the church could be rebuilt. Maren said that seemed right. He left looking lighter than he had arrived, which was the purpose of honest accounting. Silas Ward came on a Tuesday and went to Della. Maren was at the far end of the clearing, working through a set of measurements with Everett when she saw him come up the ridge trail. He moved without his usual swagger. Hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground until he got close enough that looking down was no longer a reasonable option. Della was outside with Boone, working on a careful drawing of the avalanche path for the Historical Society, because Maren had said someone should document it, and Della had taken this as a personal assignment. Silas stopped a few feet from her and looked at the drawing. Your ma is something else, he said. Della looked up at him with the steady, patient gaze of a child who has been underestimated so many times that the experience has lost its power to surprise her. I know, she said. Silas opened his mouth, closed it. Whatever he had prepared had not survived contact with Della's expression. He looked at the drawing again. The detail is real good, he said. The avalanche path. I'm documenting it for the Historical Society, Della said. Mama says the record matters, so people remember. Silas stood there another moment, nodded once, and went back down the trail. He did not laugh in the old way after that. Not the particular performance of it, the kind that required an audience and made other people smaller. Whether the change was permanent was a thing only time would answer, but the beginning of a change is still a beginning. Marshall Cobb Pruitt left on the 5th day. He came to the cabin alone in the early morning, moving up the ridge trail without his horse, and without the official weight he usually carried in his body. He looked like a man who had set something down somewhere and was not entirely sure he wanted to pick it back up. Marin opened the door before he knocked. He stood on the step. The coat had been mended at the shoulder with rough thread, functional, not careful, the repair of someone who had done it themselves in poor light. He looked at her with the direct gaze of a man who has spent several nights arriving at a conclusion he is not at peace with, but has accepted. He reached into his coat, held out a folded paper. She took it, unfolded it. The formal closure of the disputed ownership claim. Every avenue Harlan Whitfield's money had opened, closed again with a single signature, stamped, dated, done. "I have a daughter," Pruitt said. He was looking past her left shoulder at something that wasn't in the room. 8 years old, lives with her mother in Billings. I don't see her much." Marin waited. "I don't know what I was thinking," he said. "That's not an excuse. I knew what I was doing. He stopped, started again. "She's 8 years old." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The sentence finished itself in the space between them, in the particular silence of a man who has spent 5 days in a room with a child and has finally understood what he was threatening to take. "Get some sleep, Marshall," Marin said. He looked at her. "That's all?" "You gave me what I needed," she said. "Go home to your daughter." He left. She watched him go down the trail until he was small and then gone, and she took the document and placed it carefully in the tin box on the shelf beside the stove, beside Eleanor Fenwick's letter, where it would sit for 19 years until a young engineer from the University of Montana pried the box from the wall and unfolded both pieces of paper and sat down on the stone floor and did not move for a long time. The claim from Billings was never refiled. Everett found a death notice in the county records 2 years later. Harlan Whitfield, 1914, heart failure. Marin read it once, folded it, and put it in the stove. Some things don't require a response. They simply end. Old Fenwick was found on the morning of the 4th day. 2 miners went to check his cabin. It sat on the lower edge of the ridge, a few hundred yards from Marin's. Close enough to have been reachable in the storm, but far enough that the path wasn't obvious in the dark and the wind. He was in his chair beside the cold stove. The doctor said he had been gone since the first night. It would have been quick, the cold that absolute, and the man that old. And he had made his choice with the same quiet deliberateness with which he had made every other choice she had observed in the 3 months she'd known him. He had counted the people coming up the ridge trail. He had known there wasn't room, and he had stayed. Beside him on the table was a sheaf of papers. Marin stood in the doorway of his cabin and looked at them for a moment before she crossed the room. They were drawings, architectural drawings, done in a careful and precise hand that she recognized immediately from Eleanor's note, the same deliberate pressure of someone writing things meant to last, but expanded, complete. Every measurement Eleanor had worked out in her first hard winter, every technique, every specification reconstructed from 30 years of a man's memory of watching his wife work and think and figure things out in the cold. The drainage lines, the wall thickness, the beam sizing, the exact angle of the roof relative to the prevailing wind off the upper ridge. Every number matched what Marin had built. Not approximately. Exactly. At the top of the first page, in Fenwick's own hand, in careful block letters, Eleanor started it. You finished it. Now teach the next one. Marin sat down on the floor of his cold cabin with the sheaf of drawings in her lap. She was not a woman who cried easily or often or in front of people. She sat alone in the cold with the drawings, and she let herself feel the full weight of what he had done. Not just in the last days, but across 30 years of patient returning, of coming back to this valley and finding it wrong and staying anyway, of watching her build from a careful distance, and correcting only what needed correcting and trusting her with the rest. I've been watching to see if you'd find it yourself. She had found it. Both of them had found it. Eleanor Fenwick in the winter of 1887 and Marin Whitfield in the winter of 1912, reading the same ground, speaking the language the earth offered to anyone willing to learn it, arriving at the same conclusions because the earth had only one set of true answers, and it gave them to anyone who asked correctly. She sat for a long time. Then she carried the drawings back up to her cabin and spread them on the table. Then she went to find Garrett Calloway. The rebuilding of Alder Creek took 2 summers. The decision not to rebuild in the valley was made in February in a meeting at the forge. 26 people on improvised benches in the heat of the iron furnace, a map of the valley and the ridge spread on the anvil. Marin showed them Eleanor Fenwick's drawings and her own and explained the principle: the earth as insulation, the hill as windbreak, the beam sizing, the drainage, the angle. The way her father had explained things worth explaining, without decoration, because the thing itself was sufficient. When she finished, Garrett said, "How long to teach someone to build like this?" "A week for the basics," Marin said. "A season to do it right. Then we start in spring." She made one condition. She did not charge for the teaching. Not money, not goods, not favors. She asked only that each person who learned the method teach at least one other person before the following winter. A chain, not a transaction. Knowledge moving forward the way it had moved to reach her, from Eleanor to the tin box to Marin, and now from Marin outward into the town, and from the town forward into time. The first summer, 11 cabins rose on the lower ridge. The second summer, 23 more. 34 buildings total, each one set into the hillside with the back wall against the earth and the roof beams to Eleanor Fenwick's specifications. The new Alder Creek looked nothing like the old one. It climbed the ridge in a long, irregular curve. The cabins staggered at different heights, smoke rising from 34 chimneys on winter mornings in a way that looked less like a town and more like a conversation the mountain was having with itself. In the winter of 1914, a storm came that rivaled the blizzard of 1913 in duration, though not in its aftermath. The snowpack held, the roofs held, the stone walls held their warmth through 4 days of wind that stripped every loose board from every unprotected structure in the county. Not one of the 34 ridge cabins lost so much as a shingle. Marin recorded this in a letter to Della, who was 12 that year, and had begun keeping a journal of weather observations. She noted the temperatures, the wind speed she estimated by the behavior of the trees. The interior temperatures she measured each morning with the same thermometer she had watched in December of 1912. She was methodical about it because her father had been methodical and Eleanor Fenwick had been methodical, and there was a value in the accumulation of careful observation that went beyond any single storm or season. She was building a record, not because she needed to prove anything. She had proved what she needed to prove, and to whom she needed to prove it, and it was done. She was building a record because records were how knowledge survived, and she had learned in the hardest possible way that knowledge did not survive on its own. It had to be carried, it had to be written down and taught and passed forward deliberately by people who understood that the gap between one generation and the next was real and permanent and required active effort to bridge. Eleanor Fenwick had understood this. Marin understood it now. Everett Voss built his office on the lower ridge with a window that faced the valley. He had been present throughout the rebuilding, more present than professional necessity required, which both of them understood without discussing it. He showed up when there was heavy work and did it without commentary. He brought food. He fixed things. He had a quality of useful quietness that Marin found herself depending on without having decided to depend on it, which was, she reflected, probably the most honest form of dependence. He asked her on a Tuesday morning in May, beside the creek where the snowmelt ran cold and fast through the new willows. No ring. He had not presumed to purchase one without asking first, which was exactly the kind of judgment she had come to expect from him. Just the question, stated plainly. Della was standing 10 feet away, facing the water with the elaborate casualness of a child pretending not to be paying close attention. Papa would have liked him, Della said to the creek. Marin looked at her daughter, then at Everett, then at the cold, fast water. Yes, she said, to all of it. They were married in the cabin in May, a ceremony conducted by the Reverend, witnessed by Garrett and Mrs. Aldine and Della and Boone, who sat beside Della with the composed solemnity of a dog who understands the significance of occasions and takes his role in them seriously. Boone died in the winter of 1926. He was old, older than most dogs reach, which Marin had always attributed to the quality of his sense of purpose. 14 years of keeping watch, of knowing where everyone was and whether they were safe, of pressing against the side of a child who needed something steady to press against. He had been doing it since Della found him at the dump in October of 1912 with a length of frayed rope around his neck, and he had not stopped doing it until he simply stopped. He died in his sleep beside the stove, in the same spot he had claimed on the first cold night in the half-built cabin, the spot he had returned to every night for 14 years. Della found him in the morning and sat with him a long time before she came to get Marin. Garrett made the marker from oak, solid, well-fitted, no wasted motion in the joinery. He kept watch. He always kept watch. They buried him at the edge of the clearing in a spot that got the afternoon sun. Della cried without trying not to. Everett stood beside Marin with his hand over hers and said nothing, which was exactly right. Marin did not cry at the grave. She went inside afterward and cried in the kitchen, briefly and thoroughly, and then washed her face and went back out. Della's book was published in 1928. She was 24 years old, which the university press had noted with some reservation, and which Della had treated as an irrelevant data point. The book was 340 pages and was called What the Earth Remembers. It covered geological observation, practical construction, medicinal herbalism, and the history of earth-sheltered building in the American West, with a full chapter on the work of Eleanor Fenwick of Alder Creek, Montana, and a detailed appendix of Fenwick's original drawings, which Della had spent 2 years transcribing with the exactness her grandfather had taught her mother and her mother had taught her. The dedication read, "For my mother, who taught me to read the earth, and for the earth, which never lied to her." Maren read it in 2 sittings. When she finished, she sat quietly for a while. Then she went to the shelf beside the stove, took down the tin box, and removed Eleanor Fenwick's letter and read it one more time. The paper had gone darker with the years, the color of old honey now, the ink faded at the edges but still legible, still deliberate. Each letter pressed firmly into the page by a woman who had needed the words to last. She put the letter back, put the box back on the shelf, sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet. "There it is," she said, not to anyone, just to the room and the shelf, and the 19 years between the tin box and this afternoon. She wrote Della a letter that evening. Not long. Maren had never been a writer of long letters, believing that most things worth saying could be said plainly and briefly without loss of meaning. She said that she had read the book carefully and found it accurate, which for Maren was the highest form of praise she could offer. She said that her father would have approved of the appendix. She said that Eleanor Fenwick would have been pleased to be remembered correctly, which was better than being remembered fondly. She sent the letter the next morning and went back to work. The new Alder Creek was 15 years old by then, settled into itself. The cabins weathered to a silver gray that made them nearly invisible against the hillside and certain lights. People who passed through the valley sometimes stopped to look up at the ridge and asked what the buildings were. The locals explained. Some of the visitors were skeptical. Most, when they heard the whole story, were not. The avalanche path in the valley had grown over with young aspen and willow, scrubby, fast-growing, the plants that always moved in first after a disturbance. In another 20 years, it would look like forest. In 50, it would be indistinguishable from the rest of the valley. But the people who lived on the ridge knew what it was. They knew the way you know a scar, not by looking at it constantly, but by never quite forgetting it is there. The spring of 1931 came late. Snow still held on the upper ridge in March, pale and patient, and the valley below the cabin showed the first tentative green of new grass along the creek banks. The creek that ran where it had always run, through the place where Alder Creek had stood before the mountain, reminded everyone what the valley floor was actually for. 34 rooftops were visible from the cabin porch, smoke from 34 chimneys on cold mornings. A town that had learned, the hard way and the only way some lessons can be learned, what it meant to read the ground before you built on it. Maren was 61 years old. She sat on the porch on a March afternoon with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching the ridge the way she had watched it for 19 years, not with anxiety anymore, but with the attentiveness of someone who has made a long acquaintance and respects it. Everett was inside. She could hear him in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a man at home in a space he has occupied long enough to move through it without thinking. 18 years they had been married, long enough that she could not always remember, in the ordinary run of a day, what it had been like before, which was the deepest form of belonging she knew. Long enough that Della had grown up with him in the house and had never, to Maren's knowledge, thought of him as anything other than hers. Long enough that the cabin had stopped being the place Maren had built and become simply the place they lived, which was a different and better thing. The tin box still sat on the shelf beside the stove. Marin had never moved it. She had been asked twice by the Historical Society whether they might display it in their collection in Missoula. She had said no both times, politely but without elaboration. The box belonged on the shelf. It belonged in the cabin it had always been in, on the wall it had always been on, within reach of the stove whose warmth it had been measuring, in its way, for more than 40 years. Eleanor Fenwick had nailed it there. It could stay. Her granddaughter came around the corner of the cabin. Eleanor, Della's daughter, 6 years old, named without discussion for the woman in the tin box, had her grandmother's quality of paying attention. She carried Della's old slate under one arm and had clearly been drawing rocks again, which was a thing she did the way other children drew houses or horses, with a concentration that suggested she was documenting rather than inventing. She stopped at the porch steps and looked up. "Grandma," she said, "were you scared when you built it?" Marin looked at her granddaughter. Dark eyes, her mother's stubborn mouth, a piece of slate under her arm for recording what she found. 6 years old, and already the thing she reached for when she wanted to understand the world was stone. She thought about October 1912, the spade going into cold ground before the sun had cleared the peaks, Della's fever in the half-built walls, the pen in her hand, and the blank paper. The fracture line on the snowpack getting longer every morning while the town laughed below. She thought about the 41 people who had slept on her floor and eaten her beans and gone home afterward to rebuild their lives in a different way. She thought about Fenwick, sitting alone in his chair because he had counted the people on the trail and found one too many. She thought about Eleanor's note, pressed into paper with the pressure of someone who had needed the words to last, and the 30 years it had waited in the dark before arriving in exactly the right hands at exactly the right moment. "Every single day, my darling," she said, "but the earth never lied to me, not once." The child considered this with the thoroughness of someone for whom it was a genuinely important statement, not a figure of speech. "Will you teach me to read it?" Marin set down her coffee, stood up from the porch chair, held out her hand. "Let's start right now," she said. They walked out into the clearing together, the old woman and the child, and Marin knelt beside a flat outcropping of stone at the edge of the ridge and pressed her palm against it the way her father had taught her and his notes had preserved. And Eleanor Fenwick had understood before either of them, and the earth had been waiting to show anyone willing to ask. The stone was cold under her palm. It was always cold in March. But 6 feet down, she knew, the earth stayed close to 50 degrees, always. Didn't matter what the air did above it. "Feel this," she said, and took her granddaughter's small hand and pressed it flat against the stone. The child's eyes went wide. "It's cold," she said. "Yes," Marin said, "but underneath it's warm, and that warmth doesn't change. Doesn't matter what the weather does, doesn't matter what the season is. It's always there." "How do you know?" "Because someone taught me. And someone taught her before that. And someone taught him before that." She looked at her granddaughter. "And now I'm teaching you." The child was quiet for a moment, her hand still flat against the stone. "What else?" she said. Marin smiled. "Everything," she said. "Let's start with everything." Inside the cabin, the tin box sat on its shelf, 2 pieces of paper inside, folded with care, one written by a woman in 1887 who had not quite finished what she started, One signed by a man in 1913 who had not understood what he was doing until the storm made it plain. The stone wall behind the stove was warm. It was always warm. Outside, a grandmother was teaching a child to read the ground. The chain held. The earth kept its promise. The earth never lied. The Historical Society placed their marker on the cabin door that same spring. Brass plate, simply worded, built by Marin Whitfield, 1912. She built it alone. She saved them all. The young engineer from the University of Montana read it twice before he packed his satchel and began the walk back down the ridge trail. He had come for documentation, numbers, facts. He had those. 54 degrees inside a stone cabin in March with no fire burning. Beam dimensions that matched a 30-year-old note word for word. A drainage system that had shed every spring melt for 19 years without a single failure. He had the numbers. He had the facts. But he also had something he had not expected to find, and he was not sure exactly how to write it into a Historical Society report. So he did not try. He simply walked down the trail in the cold spring morning and thought about two women who had stood on the same ridge 30 years apart and read the same ground and come to the same conclusions and built the same things and left the same knowledge behind for whoever came next. He thought about the chain of it. He thought, the earth never lies. He did not know where that thought came from. He had not read the note. He had folded it carefully and replaced it in the tin box and nailed the box back into the stone wall exactly where he had found it, because some things belong where they are. He just thought it, walking down the trail in the cold spring light, the way you sometimes think a true thing without knowing how you came to know it. The earth never lies. You just have to learn its language. If you are facing your own storm right now, remember her.